So we were discussing causes of increased chance that stressors become stress, which becomes strain. And what we talked about was cause number one, and there was a fair amount under cause number one. They were about the actual design of the job itself. We're going to talk about more causes of this, and some of these are going to be easier or harder for organizations to handle. The first of the causes is cause number two, work versus non-work. So this can be either role conflict or role juggling. Role conflict is an incompatibility between the various sets of obligations people face. In other words, there's just not enough time in the day. It may be requiring people to decide to make some tough choices, but currently they are expected and they're trying to juggle just too much. For example, family, friends, work, maybe belonging into a band or some other kind of extracurricular activity. I often saw this in students that I was working with when I was actually the director of a graduate program. And about once a year, I'd have to sit down with one of our students and basically say, hey, you need to really take a look at everything you're doing and decide what's important. And it may not be that graduate school is one of the things that isn't. But if it isn't, then you need to remove some stuff. You need to focus on what's important to you because currently, probably, I know your graduate career is suffering, but probably everything is because of role conflict. Role juggling isn't necessarily that there's too much to do. It's basically the need to switch back and forth between the demands of work and family are a little bit too difficult. In other words, another way to think of role juggling is I've got the example here of having a sick child. So you might have a fairly balanced work life family kind of situation where you know that you have a certain amount of time you have to devote to work and a certain amount of time that you devote to your family. And suddenly a child becomes sick. So the demands of that non-work actually start to put a lot of stressors on the demands of work because something has to give. This isn't necessarily about having too much to do. It's about something changing in that environment, or the differences or expectations between the two are big enough that they're also causing stressors to become stress. This might be an example for, think about it, that of location. So you might have someone who is working full time, and if they lived near where they worked full time, it wouldn't be an issue, but they live 2 hours away, which means you're also adding commute times back and forth, and that might also be an example of role juggling. Both of these are going to be situations where we find it more likely that what would be considered normal stressors for most might also start to become truly stress and strain. The next one is just the stress from uncertainty, cause number three. This often comes with role ambiguity, and this is a little bit easier for organizations to address. It's uncertainty about what to do and what is expected to do on the job. For example, when we start a new job, especially if there's no training, does that mean that we immediately know what to do? I know that I've been in some jobs that have been very good about training me up once I've taken the job. I've also been in some jobs which basically kind of threw me to the wolves. We hired you to know what to do. It's time to figure it out. I can tell you from my own experiences that being thrown to the wolves is a lot more difficult. Yes, the information's there. Yes, I can figure it out, but I'm having to try to figure out every single task that I'm asked to do. So, for example, instead of being asked to do a job analysis and also being paired with someone that's done them before that can train me up to where I understand how this organization does those tasks, just being told, do a job analysis. You should know how, and here's a site which has all the information of how we do it. That requires a lot more effort and a lot more time. And again, that's going to be what was once a stressor that would easily be perceived as an easy stressor. In other words, not something to worry about, not something that's going to become a stress or a strain, now becomes a stress or a strain because of that uncertainty. So obviously organizations have a fair amount of reasons, if you will, to make sure that they're providing proper training for new employees, but also making sure it's very clear what is expected and what is not expected in any particular role within the organization. Our next cause is overload and underload. And I'm going to first talk about overload, but both overload and underload basically have two forms, quantitative and qualitative. So overload, quantitative overload, is simply the belief that one is required to do more work than one possibly can in a specific period of time. There's just too much to do. Yes, I know how to do these reports. Yes, I know how to write an analysis sheet, but I'm being asked to do 10 of them a day, and at most, each one takes me an hour to do, which means in an 8-hour day, I can do 8 of them, and that's if I don't take breaks. I'm being asked to do 10 a day. That's quantitative overload. Qualitative overload is the belief that one lacks the required skills or abilities to perform a given job. So I'm being asked to write a technical report that I've never written before, and I really don't even know what belongs in it. That would be qualitative overload. Both of these, obviously, and this kind of piggybacks, if you will, off the idea of role ambiguity, results in people being much more likely to perceive stressors as strain or stress and strain. The reverse of it is underload, and this can also have a negative effect on people, though honestly, it is less impactful. In other words, we're more worried about overload in the workplace than underload. Underload quantitatively or qualitatively. So quantitatively is simply you just don't have enough to do. My entire job involves writing reports. It takes me an hour to write each report, and I'm given 4 a day, but I'm expected to be here for 8 hours. And I've been in jobs like this before. I have been actually fairly recently, a few years ago, I worked in a job where the amount of tasks that I was given daily took me about half the day, but it was a 9 to 5 job, and I was expected to be in my office that entire time, mainly just to be available if people had questions. But that still meant that I spent a fair amount of time just kind of sitting at my desk and playing on my phone because I had already done all the tasks that were required of that day. Qualitative underload is the lack of mental stimulation that accompanies many routine or repetitive jobs. So if what I was being asked to do was appropriate for the amount of time, it takes me an hour to do each of these tasks, and I'm given 8 a day. That's fine. I can get 8 a day done, but they don't really engage my skills. I'm not really having to think hard about them. They're very simple to do. That would be qualitative underload. And again, both of these situations may not necessarily result in someone perceiving stressors as stress and strain. They do result in negative outcomes generally in most people. Now, again, I want to put that caveat out there that there is individual differences. Some people thrive when they're overloaded, and some people truly enjoy being underloaded. But for most people, these are two situations that we want to avoid, and we can do that through job design. And that's really what we're getting at in all of these, is we want to make sure that we're designing jobs to where most of these are being handled by the very description of the job itself, the training of the job, and an understanding of what someone's capable of doing within that job. Cause number 5, and we kind of touched on this a little bit with cause number 1, is responsibility for others. So the more responsibility you have for others, the more likely you are to experience stress and strain. So deadline schedules, getting staff to work hard, needing to make changes, maintaining budgets, looking good to superiors, the more you're having to do, and the more that what you have to do is dependent on the success or failure of others, the more likely that job is going to result in stress and strain. Now, there is going to be certain roles in organizations that by its very nature are going to be responsible for others, but we should also be aware that they're increasing the likelihood of that person needing some time off occasionally, needing some resources to be able to deal with this stress. Cause number 6 is lack of social support, the cost of isolation. People do better with a network of friends, and managers that are supported by colleagues report fewer physical ailments. So generally, one of the biggest predictors of someone experiencing stressors, becoming stress, becoming strain, is also social isolation. And this is the same for both introverts and extroverts. There are individual differences, and obviously people that are introverted prefer less social support, but they still want to feel supported. They still want to believe that they are a part of a network, that they're part of a team, and that people do care about their success. When we find a large amount of social support, and especially for the extroverted people, the ability to have these social interactions, they generally actually report fewer physical ailments and also report less stress and strain. Comparatively, when we find people that are very socially isolated, do not have a network of friends, do not have a lot of support, we usually find negative increases in outcomes. Cause 7 is sexual harassment, unwelcome sexual advancements, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature. This can be subtle as well as overt. And there's two basic types, quid pro quo and hostile environment. And we're going to talk about both of those. But basically, this means that we're having to deal with something above and beyond the work expectations. Basically, we're either being targeted because of our gender and our sexuality in a negative way, that's hostile environment, or basically various coworkers are trying to make the workplace more sexual. They're trying to do quid pro quo, where they're expecting sexual favors or a relationship of a sexual nature to form. What research has also found is that, like with a lot of these, there is also an overt and subtle form. And what I mean by that is not only is the person that is experiencing the stress or strains for any of these reasons going to have negative outcomes, there is also a secondhand effect. So if you're aware that someone is being sexually harassed, you're also likely to experience an increase in your stress and strain at work. So let's talk about these two types of sexual harassment as we round out the slides. So sexual harassment quid pro quo is basically from the Latin line something for something. You do X for me and I'll do X for you. It describes circumstances in which a supervisor takes an adverse employment action against a subordinate for refusing to submit to the supervisor's sexual advancements. This is plainly prohibited by Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act. And there's a fair amount of research that actually shows the negative effects of this. In general, though, this is honestly, when we look at it under most current state laws, what we're talking about is a supervisor basically coercing someone into sexual acts with a threat of workplace penalty or benefit. And by most definitions of sexual assault, this isn't just workplace harassment, it very well may be assault as well. And because of that fact, we're actually seeing less quid pro quo, at least overt quid pro quo, in most workplace settings. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It means that it is becoming a smaller and smaller problem, and that's a good thing for many reasons. The other type of harassment, though, has not shown a great reduction in the last few decades. And that's hostile work environment. It describes situations or circumstances in which the workplace is permeated with a discriminatory, intimidation, ridicule, and insult that is sufficiently severe or pervasive enough to alter the conditions of the victim's employment and create an abusive work environment. That's a direct quote from the law. So was it severe and pervasive? That's really the big question with hostile environment. Hostile environment isn't about trying to actually attract sexual relationships. It's about using the environment to make it hostile to people that one disagrees with. So for example, if a boss is wanting to get with a person that works under them because they're sexually attracted to them, that would probably be quid pro quo. If a boss is trying to basically make someone feel uncomfortable in the workplace so they'll leave because they don't like the sexuality or the gender that they identify as, that would be hostile environment. So quid pro quo is more attraction driven. Hostile environment is more rejection driven. But it does need to be severe and pervasive. So severe means that it has to be strong enough or overt enough that it's actually resulting in a decrease in performance in the person being targeted. And pervasive means that it isn't a single incident. So basically, someone telling a sexist joke is rarely considered a hostile environment. But someone constantly telling sexist jokes may very well be hostile environment, severe and pervasive. And it needs to interfere with the employee's work and their work environment. There is a reasonable person standard here, and again, if you want to research this a little bit more, here's a reference. But the reasonable person standard basically states that much like any of our laws, if a reasonable person would find it offensive and find that it happened consistently and pervasive, then it would be a hostile work environment, and there is legal protection for organizations when this happens. However, above and beyond those legal requirements and the possibility of actual legal action, also people that are being targeted with sexual harassment of either type are also much more likely to experience stressors and distress and strain. So yet another area where organizations have it in their best interest to reduce or remove these from the environment in order to affect the reduction in stress and strain in an organization. So why is sexual harassment, quid pro quo, or harmful environment stressful? Again, it's a constant one more thing people are having to worry about. It affects employees, it affects coworkers. It also makes people feel that they're at a dead end, hopelessness, or no other alternative. So in other words, if you are being targeted with either type of harassment, you probably are not very confident that your career will go anywhere. You probably do not feel positive about the organization. You're constantly having to worry about incidents that are going to occur. And that, of course, makes it much more likely that through that cognitive appraisal process, normal or acceptable stressors are going to be identified as hard to handle or one more thing, which results in stress and strain. So the goal here was not to go into detail on sexual harassment. We spent 3 slides on it, but just to recognize that much like many other aspects in the workplace, it can have a direct effect on how people perceive their ability, their self-efficacy, to handle the day-to-day stressors that their job may include. And that organizations, by using this list of 7 types of things that result in people having a greater response to stressors becoming stress and strain, to allow them to create work organizations, to create workplaces, and to create roles that are much less likely to be susceptible to all of these problems. So we'll wrap up this module in the next section, and I look forward to talking to you with the next module.